The reason why Trump lost 2020 has long been a contested topic. Many people believe that it was because of his generally unappealing rudeness or his poor job at influencing legislation, or some even blame Trump's loss on election interference. Though what I believe actually caused Trump to lose in 2020 was none of those. So, to understand what I believe caused Trump to lose in 2020, let's first show why the other commonly named reasons were not to blame for his loss. The primary reasons that are named for Trump's loss are often divided along party lines. On the right, many claim that election fraud made Trump lose, while on the left, many claim that it was his rudeness or his poor performance at being president. Let's first take a look at why no substantial evidence is there to support the claim that Trump lost because of election interference. Now, I'm not saying absolutely zero election interference occurred. After all, in all modern American elections, there has been at least some election fraud or election interference. What I'm saying is the amount that was there was not substantial enough to warrant calling the election invalid or stating that he should have won the presidency and not Joe Biden. The amount of votes that I believe was fraudulently cast is probably around the hundreds, maybe low thousands. And these are all examples that have been found of like dead people voting or a regular number, but this is not enough to support saying that the whole election was invalid and that Donald Trump won and Joe Biden lost. People often cite how Joe Biden won a record number of votes compared to any other candidate before him, despite his unappealing nature and not being the most loved president on the ballot ever. This can easily be explained to the use of mail-in ballots, since mail-in ballots were used significantly more than any other election, and since mail-in ballots are able to be used best in urban areas where Democrats are dominant. This would lead to more votes than a regular year because of this. Another commonly argued thing is that the votes mysteriously flipped or came in irregular amounts. This argument seems compelling at first glance, but the thing is, there just really isn't that many examples of this occurring. There's a few different graphs people point at, and we'll show this and be like, here's the verifiable evidence election fraud occurred. But the fact is, that's just kind of how how the system works, to where it comes in like chunks or to lag and freeze. And it's not the fault of no ballots coming in. It's just the fault of the system registering how many are live going at a certain time. And the idea that these millions of votes were fraudulent just doesn't have the verifiable evidence. In all 63 lawsuits that Trump had brought forth, where his lawyers were given a chance to explain themselves, not a single one succeeded. You would think that if there was a lawsuit that had substantial enough evidence and it was credible and that there was a good chance that it was believed and you had a Republican judge, it wouldn't be dismissed. But even in all the different counties where there was a Republican judge and it was brought forth, it was all dismissed. No judge believed it. There was sufficient evidence. And therefore, this could not really be the cause of Trump's electoral loss in 2020. Now, time to address the claims of Trump losing due to his wild unpopularity and his poor job at being president. As to Trump being wildly unpopular, this does at least have some merit. There was a large percentage of Americans who started sour on Trump but became vehemently opposed to him, though I believe this did not wildly change people's minds. In other words, I think that the people who disliked Trump in 2016 are basically the same people who vehemently hated him in 2020, with maybe some mild changes. I don't think that many voters flipped to Biden after voting Trump. In fact, despite everything the media would lead you to believe, according to a Gallup poll week to week of Trump's approval ratings, his highest rate ever reached was in 2020, at a considerable 49% on his election year, which is compared to even when he was elected into president the first week at 45%, which isn't even like an accurate representation, because in following weeks immediately after he was first sworn in, he had dropped down to the mid-30s. So that's a considerable change, up to a 49% approval rating. So it can't necessarily be that he was wildly unpopular in the public's eye. But okay, enough dealing with polls. Let's just say none of that matters. Toss it all out. That all these may have tried to judge the perception of Trump, but they were inaccurate, and people believed he did a poor job despite what all the polls said. In 2020, the top 5 issues Americans were basing their voting on, according to Pew Research, were economy, healthcare, Supreme Court appointments, the coronavirus, and violent crime. On all these topics, which with the notable exception of one, which we'll get to later, Trump succeeded. On the economy, with the exception of COVID and later, GDP was increasing every year over year, the nation was hitting record lows in unemployment, and inflation was under the limit of 2%. As for healthcare, Trump caused prescription drug costs to lower, he expanded access to affordable coverage, and created hospital and insurer price transparency. As to Supreme Court appointments, well, that's essentially entirely partisan of whether or not you think he did a great job, and that'll depend on your political leaning. But for his constituency, he did a great job of appointing justices whose voters were for. And for violent crime, it decreased year to year under his presidency, and all of these stats showed that it wasn't his unpopularity or his performance or election fraud that caused Trump to lose 2020. So, what is it? What is the thing that caused Trump to lose that I've been building up? Well, it's the one event that caused the whole world to fall to its knees. The one event that caused unemployment to rise almost 10%. One little thing that caused a historically unprecedented time period. Well, you know what? Enough suspense. You know what I'm talking about. It's COVID. The singular thing that caused Trump to lose was COVID. I know what you're thinking. After all that buildup, I better have a halfway decent explanation and not be telling you all to subscribe down there if you like the content and to hit the like button. All right. Back to the subject, though. The reason COVID caused Trump to lose is that it ruined most of Trump's legacy and it changed the rules of the election. So how did it ruin his legacy? With all the topics that I mentioned as a part of Trump's accomplishments, you'll notice that I mentioned they were all true up until COVID, and that I'd get back to it later. Well, now's later, and here's the reasons. I said until COVID is that COVID essentially ruined anything Trump created. The economy imploded, drugs got more expensive, and anyone remembers from 2020 is the pandemic. There's no fond memories of Trump in 2020 because the only memories in 2020 is of the pandemic, essentially. This changed the 2020 election to being a referendum on Biden and what he could bring to the table, since Trump was pretty popular, and to being a referendum on Trump because of how bad the state of America was with COVID, despite all this being unavoidable on his part, essentially. Though even the parts where Trump was given a chance or an opportunity to start a successful course through COVID, to not ruin all his accomplishments, he ruined it by giving control over to Fauci. This caused all economy gains to be lost and for people to grow sour on Trump. Because out of anyone who you would think would give control to a left-leaning scientist who wanted to shut down the country to stop essentially a mild cold, you would think a Republican president would be the last person to do so. This left a sour taste in many Republicans' mouth and left many independents to flip because they thought they were voting for a president who would stick strong and not be turning willy-nilly. And even in 2016, the Democrats tasted defeat, where they thought victory was for sure. They thought Trump stood no chance and Hillary Clinton was going to win, absolutely. Because of this, they didn't hold back any punches in 2020. They weren't taking any chances. They nominated a presidential candidate who had no personality of his own and was hidden from the public. Though in the year of COVID, this set Biden up perfectly compared to Trump. Trump is such a naturally bombastic personality that anyone who attacked him was essentially perfectly parried and obliterated. Therefore, by putting up a geriatric daughter, Trump was left up to having the perception of punching down and appearing like a bully. This greatly benefited Biden in his polls, despite him himself being, well, no saint. Though the biggest reason that caused the 2020 election to be Biden's victory is how the election was handled in an unprecedented, biased manner. Due to COVID, the election had to be held in a manner where people quarantined could still vote and have access to their fundamental American right. This led to the increased use of mail-in ballots, which used to only be for select circumstances, but now they're being brought in to include more people ever than before. Only 27% of all voters voted in person on election day. 27. For reference, in 2016, 23.5% of voters voted via absentee ballots, while in 2020, 46% of voters voted by absentee ballot. That is almost twice as many people voting via absentee. Though how does this affect who won 2020? Well, in the same Pew Research study stated before, it stated that 32% of Trump voters voted absentee, while 58% of Biden voters voted absentee. This disparity essentially tells the story of 2020, just in the contrast there. Because so many Biden voters were apathetic to him, they had limited desire to go all the way to the voting booth to cast a ballot. Though if you bring the ballots to the apathetic voters, then they might as well put their preference on there. Though the reason didn't necessarily help Trump voters is because of how absentee ballots uniquely help urban voters who primarily vote Democrat. After all, in 2020, there was a record number of votes with 159 million voters. And it sure isn't because of the massive population change or a wild popularity of Biden. With all of this taken into consideration, it is clear why Trump lost in 2020. It wasn't an election fraud. It wasn't his wild unpopularity, and it wasn't Trump's bad performance. It simply comes down to COVID changing how everything was done, and it uniquely benefited Democrats electorally. As always, if you have any disagreements or comments, I'd love if you could comment them down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Have a nice day.